Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have with us in our studio Port Townsend resident Barbara Sjoholm. She is a novelist, memoirist, translator, and biographer. Her newest of many, many books is Black Fox, A Life of Amelia Demont Hutt, artist and ethnographer. This book follows the publication of her novel about the youthful romance of Amelia Hutt with Danish composer Carl Nielsen and her translation of Hutt's narrative with the lapse in the high mountains. You can read more about Barbara Sjoholm on her website at www.barbarasjoholm.com, and I'm going to spell that for you, BARBARASJOHOLM. Welcome to the program, Barbara.
Hi, Sheila.
I'm thrilled to have you here in another interview because you're prolific with your books, and they're always fun to learn about. So Black Fox is the biography of a Danish artist who had a chance meeting with a Sami wolf hunter on a train in Sweden and became an ethnographer exploring the Sami regions. How did you learn of her life, and what drew you to write her biography?
I have always been really interested in the north of Scandinavia, and I suppose that's partly because I grew up in Southern California without any snow at all. So I was up there in 2001 and traveling around and collecting stories and writing articles, journalism, and those eventually became a book called The Palace of the Snow Queen. And during that time, I was collecting material on travelers up in Lapland, and one of them I heard about was Amelia Demont Hutt and about Johan Turi, the Sami man who she met by chance on a train. And I was really fascinated with this story. I didn't know very much about it, but I knew that both of them had written books, and that he had written one called Muitala Samed Bira, an account of the Sami, and she helped him with that. And that was published in 1910, and then she had published a book called With the Lapse in the High Mountains in 1913. And I read her book in Danish, and I read his, which had been translated to English, and I was quite enchanted with both of them. They were very different from each other, but in a way that they were quite in sync. So that was my first interest. The more I learned about both of them, I realized what an unusual relationship they had for the time. It didn't fit into the usual categories of ethnographer and informant. It didn't even fit in the contemporary term of collaborative ethnography. Originally, she was seen as sort of the instigator of the book, and in a colonialist way, she was seen as almost the author of it. A lot of people didn't believe that this Sami herder had actually written it. And so she had to prove over and over again that he was the author by showing manuscript fragments. But she did translate it into Danish, and then she edited it. She was really the managing editor of the whole project. She included artwork that he did, and she let the world know about it. She kind of oversaw translations. Kind of oddly enough, for all of her fame at the time and his fame, she kind of dropped out of the story, and he became actually quite famous. He's very well known in Sami literature and in Scandinavia as the father of Sami literature. So this was the first book published in Sami by a Sami author. And she sort of got erased. She was called his secretary or his housekeeper or his muse or his girlfriend. So it's really a publishing story, and those kinds of things interest me a lot, having been a publisher and editor earlier in my life. And the more I researched her, the more I got excited by the fact that she was not only an ethnographer, but she was very focused on women and children. And this was about 10 or 20 years before Margaret Mead went to Samoa. So no one had ever done this kind of participant observation in Scandinavia, and no one had collected this huge amount of material on Sami women and children, on pregnancy and miscarriages and childbirth, and on courtship and on death and all kinds of things. And then finally, if there weren't so many other reasons to be interested in her, she was a fantastic artist.
That's what I was going to ask you about, because I remembered reading it in your bio. So she certainly was using both sides of her brain.
Absolutely. And she had a very conventional art education. She was one of the early women to actually break into the art academy in Copenhagen. She learned perspective. She learned how to paint shadows and light. And most of her paintings you can see are of lamplight and women sitting and reading. I mean, very much turn-of-the-century work. But in the 30s and 40s, she really became quite a prolific expressionist. And so she did linocuts. She did lots of paintings. Many of them have the motif of Lapland or Sapmi. She really got ahead of steam going when she was in her 60s. And so in the 30s and 40s, and even up almost to her death in 1958, she was still producing art, which I think is actually quite incredible.
Right. So almost everything about her life fascinated you, from the snowlands to what she did for women and wrote about. How long did the research on this book take you?
Well, I think that the projects developed sort of organically. So at first there's just, oh, what an interesting woman. I think I'll read her book. Oh, I think I'll find out a little bit more about her by going to a museum and seeing if they have the paintings. And so I did that in Denmark. And around 2007, after I had published my travel book about Lapland, the Palace of the Snow Queen, I actually thought, well, I really would love to translate her book with the Lapps in the high mountains. And I do know Norwegian. I'd translated from Norwegian. I hadn't done anything in Danish, but they're not so different that I couldn't imagine it. And I thought that I would write an introduction that had a lot of biographical information. But of course, the more I learned, the more I thought, oh my God, this is huge. There's a lot here. And meanwhile, I had really wanted to include some material about her early life. When she was 14, she met a boy, or actually a young man, 22, Carl Nielsen, who her aunt and uncle had kind of taken under their wing in Copenhagen. They had decided he was rather talented and they would help him through the conservatory. In fact, he turned out to be Denmark's greatest composer. And they had this kind of secret engagement going on when she was only 14 to 16. And I thought that was actually fascinating. There was not a lot of archival material.
How did you find any material about the secret?
Well, and when she was in her 70s, during the German occupation of Denmark, she had a lot of time on her hands, so she was typing up notes, she was painting, and she decided to write a memoir about Carl Nielsen and her young days. She didn't want it published. She told her husband after she died to take it to the Copenhagen Library and the manuscript department and deposit it for 25 years. And that was the restriction. It actually was never cataloged and everyone forgot about it. So about 50 years later, someone found it and they had published it. And so I learned a number of things from that, but still I had to do much more. Anyway, after I wrote this novel, Fossil Island, and its sequel, The Former World, I then thought, okay, now I'm ready to start the biography.
That is so interesting that you would take on historical fiction, I guess you would call it, first, and then write a biography. So how does that happen? And it's like you said, okay, now I'll write. Now I'm ready. But really, how does one get ready? How did that happen for you?
I think it's really interesting to think about genre forms. And for me, I had really never done academic writing per se. I had done expository writing and I had done research, but I hadn't, even when I wrote some of my travel books, done endnotes and documentation to the degree that I knew was going to be necessary for a biography, because I had certainly read a lot of books with endnotes in them, so I knew you had to have some. And I was very daunted by that. Whereas with historical fiction, you learn a lot, but of course you're free to invent too. And you're using the material really differently. For instance, just small things. She grew up in the center of Denmark in Jylland near the Limfjord, and there's an island called Fur. It's very famous for all of its fossils. And so I thought, okay, fossils and time, they're going to be part of my overriding metaphor. That was one thing. In the 1890s in Denmark, lots of discussion about the double standard and sexual morality and men taking advantage of women. And I thought that's really interesting too. I mean, the woman was only 14 when she started this with Carl Nielsen. So all those things are things I wanted to explore that were not part of the archives.
Right. So you get to explore issues that are of interest to you using her background.
Yeah.
And the title of the book is Fossil Island, so that metaphor became really important.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So would you like to read from each of the books so we can kind of get a little bit of an idea of the difference between what you do as an author with historical fiction and what's demanded of you as a biographer who needs endnotes?
Well, I will read a little bit from Fossil Island, just the beginning, and it occurred to me as I was thinking about this that they both, in a way, begin with stories of meeting people out of the blue. Two men in two different ways who completely changed who she was. They didn't define her, but in a way, they made more things possible for her. So this is from the opening chapter of Fossil Island. She followed the lovesick cries and dark-hearted groans into the parlor. A boy was half inside their old Marshall piano, his backside sticking out, rounded and muscular, in blue flannel trousers. Mama and Aunt Marie, eyes riveted on the trousers, sat side by side on the green silk sofa with a curvy padded back. They held their ears tight and grimaced, but almost in pleasure. When they saw Nick, Aunt Marie shouted, "My foster son Carl is tuning your piano." The horrid twanging and groaning stopped briefly, then resumed with a sporadic tunefulness, as if a baby were banging on a little tin pot. The windows of the parlor were open, and dust from the country road blew in through the muslin drapes. Nick's mother took her hands from her ears and smoothed the dark bundles of curls at her perspiring temples. "Dearest, tell Mrs. Jesperson to bring more coffee." When she came back into the parlor, the boy was out of the piano and sitting on the bench in front of the keyboard. A rubbery sort of face, blue-eyed curiosity, lips red for a boy, his thick, light hair stuck up on top like a hedge. "My youngest daughter, Amelia," said her mother. "We call her Nick."
Well, I can see the author at work there with the dark groans and the sporadic tunefulness. It's really fun. So I'm thinking omniscient narrator who can get the whole scene, knows everybody's head at work. Enjoyed it very much.
And those just came from a couple of things in her memoir. She says she met Carl Nilsson when she was staying with another set of relatives in the neighborhood, and she got a message saying, "Carl Nilsson is here," and she came home and he was tuning her piano. So from that, I started.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking with Port Townsend author Barbara Sjoholm about her newest book, Black Fox, the story of Danish artist and ethnographer Emily Demant Hatt, who lived with Sami families in their tents and on migrations.
Did you have photos of him by any chance? Or
Yeah. He looks just like that.
Okay, so you were describing how you saw him.
Yes. He was short.
That's why he could fit inside a piano.
And he was quite a ladies' man. He had actually already impregnated a housemaid before he got there. So he had a reputation, and her parents were worried, as well they should have been. So this is a couple paragraphs from the introduction to Black Fox, and you'll notice the tone is really different. I started a little bit later, in 1940. Amelia Demant Hatt arrived in Stockholm on a bitter cold December day in 1940, 8 months after Germany had invaded and occupied Denmark. She was met at the central station by Ernst Manker, head of the new Sami department at Stockholm's Museum for Cultural History. On this trip of just a few days, arranged with some difficulty because of the war, she brought the first of many donations she would make to the Nordic Museum: a bear's tooth amulet, a blue traveling chest, and a framed canvas from her series of Lapland paintings. She had been invited to receive the Silver Hazelius Medal for her collaboration with Johan Turi, the Sami artist and writer whose first book, Muitala Samed Bira, an account of the Sami, she had edited and translated from Sami to Danish. She was to give a talk at the museum as part of a Lapland evening to celebrate Sami culture, particularly the life of Johan Turi, who had died in 1936. Amelia's speech on the evening of December 4th, 1940, was a memorable one. She traced the story of her meeting with Johan Tori on a train in Swedish Lapland 36 years earlier, a meeting that developed into an important literary and artistic relationship for them both. She told the story of how she and Tori came to work together on his book in a mining shack on the shores of Lake Torneträsk, and how Tori opened Lapland's soul to her. She described her old friend in precise, evocative words that celebrated him as an artist and writer. Amelia's warm portrait of Tori that evening and her riveting tale of how they met has been the basis for much of the romantic lore that has since sprung up about the pair. The unaccountably promising anticipation they felt encountering each other on the train, the reluctance to part after just an hour or two, the connection that sustained them throughout the creation of Tori's book, all burned bright in Amelia's speech. Our desires and interests complemented each other. Our meeting was like a well-laid fire, only waiting to be lighted. And we lit it, she said, in words that have been quoted and requoted since. She mentioned little that evening about her own accomplishments as an ethnographer, writer, and artist, preferring, as she had often done, to put Tori first and to make sure that Muitala Samedvira was always seen as his achievement. Yet she also acknowledged their mutual impact on each other. Tori became for me a key to Lapland and its people, and I became for him who was, because of language and way of life, closed off, a door out into the world, able to fulfill his dream of many years, to tell people about the inner and outer life of the mountain people.
It's beautiful. It doesn't sound like any biography I have read because your language is so musical and so vibrant, and I know that I know it's true. I know you're taking this information from what you've read of what she said and how she said it, but you've put it together with gorgeous sentences.
Oh, thank you, Sheila.
How is it different? You did mention about the focus being on the exactness of the material, the endnotes, that everything can be documented. So that's one function of how biography is different than a fictionalized novel. But for you as a writer, it sounds to me, listening to these two, that some of the same craft is involved, that you're very interested in making the biography dynamic. And it almost feels like you've inhabited, or she has inhabited you in order to write this way. Do you feel that way?
She was an inspiration to me. A lot of people who've read my translation of her work, With the Lapse in the High Mountains, have said what an incredible writer she was. And I think that she's funny. She's a great storyteller. She has a really strong visual sense because she was a painter. And her book started out from letters that she wrote home to her family. So you feel like you're right there. And I think just being in her presence was inspiring to me. I mean, I also am a visual writer, and I also like to make art. I felt a correspondence between us. I think that biographies are kind of a wonderful form. I had written some little bits and pieces of biographies of people within my other books, but this was the first time I really took something like this on to try and tell someone's life story. And in some ways, it's very novelistic. You've got this central protagonist, you've got the arc of their life, you've got this sense of destiny, you've got successes and failures and obstacles, you've got incredible characters that were real. You're trying to sort of create some suspense. So you've got a beginning, middle, and end. But you've also got history. So you're trying to paint a larger picture where they fed into history, how they affected history. So they're a historical personage, and you can't put in everything. So in fact, you're picking and choosing, and you're looking for dramatic ways to begin chapters or to end chapters. You're looking for something that will grab people, I think, in the same way as a novel.
So what you read to us was from the introduction.
Yes.
Yeah. So did you write the introduction first, or did you write it after you had a lot more shape to it?
I wrote it many years later. And I always thought originally that I would start with the train, because you always hear this story. Oh, they met on the train, they met on the train. And the train is very important because it was the most northerly train, and it was really to take iron ore from the huge iron ore mine in Kiruna over the mountains to Narvik in Norway, where it was ice-free all winter. But the building of the train and the breaking up of the Sami reindeer grazing, and all the people who then moved to Kiruna were a huge part of their story as well. So the fact they met on the train was sort of amazing just because it brought these two cultures together, but it was also very metaphoric for what was happening in terms of history.
And yet you decided not to start there.
I wanted to kind of start later and give a sense of what they had meant to each other, because in fact this was not going to be a biography that started with she was born and then the last sentence is she died, 1958. I wanted to really concentrate on her life pretty much after she turned 30. She was a late developer in some ways. I mean, like a lot of women, she was very constricted in her early years, kind of broke away, became bohemian, started smoking in Copenhagen and wearing big earrings and running around with a lot of women artists. And then she went up to the north, and no one had ever done this before. And when she came back, she was giving slideshows and she was giving talks and she was in the newspaper. She transformed herself really through this trip to Lapland personally.
I was going to ask you a question of, well, first of all, I want to say, starting where you started with her presenting and the ways in which she presented, which was to put him first, builds a lot of connection between the reader and these characters. Really, it was a lovely way to get to start knowing them and then to care about how it all happened. Where did her interest in going to the Northlands come from, and how was she funded all these years later in terms of her ethnography? Because I think of an ethnographer as having to be trained and supported by university research and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure she sounds that way to me yet. So how did this happen for her? What made her go there?
I think in those days, a lot of people were amateur travelers and they just collected. But it was highly unusual that a woman would do this.
Alone, a single traveler.
Yeah. And she said afterwards that she had always known it was her destiny to go to Lapland. And she had read books about the nomads when she was young, and she had announced to her parents that she was going to go and live as a nomad for a year. So she had always had this feeling. And she used to say when she was angry with them, I'm going to marry a Lapp and go and live in Norway or Sweden, and you'll never see me again. So it was very tied up with imagination. I think she had been trying to make a living as an artist. She graduated, she gave up at times, she started again, and she wrote that she was actually quite depressed when she was about 31. She had gone to Berlin. I think she was taking some more classes. She wrote to her sister, I'm very depressed. Her sister said, oh, I just read about this new train going through Lapland. What about it? So the two sisters just hopped on the train the summer of 1904, and she'd read about the Sami. She was desperately looking for someone to meet or to talk to. She didn't see any, or she saw them sort of in the distance. She saw 1,000 reindeer crossing the tracks. So when she met Johan Turi, she knew, this is my destiny. But the way she was funded, really, in the beginning, it was just her. She inherited a little bit of money from an aunt in Detroit, believe it or not, named Sevilla Klein, who gave her some money. And then she met this guy, Hjalmar Lombom, who was the manager of the Kiruna mine, who was actually an art collector as well as everything else. He was really interested in the Sami, and he actually funded her trips also with the man she later married, Gudmund Hutt.
Interesting to me how people do what they do. So thank you. And I take it, did she ever marry?
She married when she was 38, a man who was much younger, 12 years younger, unusual for the time, and he became an archaeologist and a cultural geographer. They went to America in 1914 and 15 and studied at Columbia with Franz Boas and traveled around America. He wrote his dissertation on moccasins.
Well, I have to say that these people who people the biography will be great inspiration to us who have sort of lost our way and don't know what interests us anymore and how to pursue it. I find it very, very inspiring. We only have a few minutes, so I was wondering, as you're doing this work, were you reading other biographies that you liked?
I was reading biographies. Not all of them are very connected to this, but I was thinking about them. I've always liked biographies. Biographies about artists and writers and travelers have always been particularly of interest. I mean, I've loved Hermione Lee's biography of Virginia Woolf and Judith Thurman, Colette, because I think that you're seeing inside a creative mind, and you're seeing how they take the material of their life and how they transform it. So certainly if I wasn't reading those particular biographies, but I was thinking about all the biographies I read and what was most interesting to me. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say thank you for doing this work. And I have only read part of the book, and I am looking forward to finishing this story. And I just appreciate so much that your connection to Longing for Snow and women in history and that kind of creative mind has coalesced into this project, which I think you told me took about 10 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And in the middle, you wrote 10 years from the time you wrote the novel, or was that part of the...
That was part of it, and also the translation was part of it.
So that your tenaciousness in sticking with this woman and all that she had to offer. So thank you. I want to remind our listeners that you can find out more about Barbara Sjoholm on her website at BarbarasJoholm.com. And I hope you'll look for her and look for some of her presentations that you do around town from time to time. And any parting words for us about any aspiring biographers out there?
Look for someone the same way you would look for a partner that you want to spend time with for a long time and get to know very deeply, because you may find out some things about them that you don't like. You may find some things that are actually antithetical to what you believe. But if you love them a lot, and you usually do when you're writing biography, you won't get tired of them. So those are my parting words of advice.
Those are wonderful, wonderful words. I think that's a wonderful way to look at who you're writing about. And even for memoirists, we often start thinking, we're going to tell our family secrets. We hate everybody. and that doesn't work. So who wants to read a book about hating everybody? So I think that even memoirists can take your advice to heart, that find somebody to love in there, and or just that you came from this milieu and really dig into it. And that's what writers do, right? So now I want to know, do you think you'll write more about this particular woman or more about Lapland, or are you onto some other subjects?
I have one more project that I just finished that the University of Minnesota will publish next year, and this is a collection of Sami folktales that Amelia collected and retold and published in 1922, called By the Fire, and it has about 25 of her linoleum cuts in it, sort of expressionist black and white style, and they're kind of amazing stories, and most of them she collected from women storytellers, so that's also one more interesting aspect of it.
So spin-offs in TV language, right?
Right, but I think that's the end. That I'm content now.
Really? Well,
Yes.
that'll be so that book is done and it's in the production pipe.
Yes, it's just started. Yeah. So it'll come out in April of next year. There are actually quite a few Sami Americans who live in the Northwest, in Port Angeles and Poulsbo in particular, and I'm hoping they might want to participate in some readings because it really is their heritage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, if they do, I certainly hope they come to Port Townsend too.
They will.
So again, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to talk about your book and biography.
Thanks, Sheila.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.